afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Davenport Manor, falling across the polished parquet floors in thin golden strips. Outside, the manicured gardens lay in serene perfection, a quiet that seemed almost designed to mock the turmoil within the grand house. Lady Eleanor Davenport, known for her impeccable taste and formidable social standing, had not been seen for over 24 hours, and that absence had begun to stir whispers among the staff. By the time the household realized something was wrong, the household physician had already arrived, summoned in a hasty telegram, and even he was left scratching his head. Eleanor's bedroom, a lavishly appointed suite on the upper floor, presented a scene both precise and perplexing. The bed had been made neatly, as though she had left only for a brief stroll. A single chair was overturned, the curtains swayed slightly, and on the writing desk lay a bundle of letters, sealed, addressed, and entirely out of place. Most conspicuously, the letters bore no sign of struggle or theft. No valuables had been touched. No trace of forced entry marred the otherwise immaculate room. The room's French windows were latched from the inside, the heavy oak door locked with its own key, still dangling in the lock as though waiting for its mistress to return. Constable Harris was the first to investigate, a competent man accustomed to petty thefts and neighbourhood brawls, but even he hesitated at the threshold. "Locked from the inside," he muttered, tapping his notebook. "No sign of anyone else having been here. Nothing stolen. Nothing moved except that chair. And those letters, of course. But they're just letters." His voice trailed off as if the words themselves were inadequate to capture the peculiarity of the scene. By the time the local newspapers began to circulate the story, "Mysterious Disappearance at Davenport Manor," Miss Jane Marple, who had recently come to the village to visit an old friend, had already arrived at the manor. She moved with her usual unassuming grace, a small notebook tucked into the pocket of her modest coat, her eyes sharp beneath the soft brim of her hat. The household, anxious and flustered, welcomed her. They had heard of her peculiar skill with perplexing cases, though few understood exactly how she achieved her results. Marple's gaze swept over the room carefully, noting the small details that might escape ordinary eyes. The floor bore no unusual footprints beyond the usual servant's shuffle. The fireplace, though used recently, contained nothing but a thin layer of ash. The letters themselves seemed ordinary at first glance, yet she lingered over them, noticing the peculiar wax seals, tiny impressions of a crescent moon and star that did not match any known Davenport crest. "Who delivered these letters?" she asked softly. Her voice, gentle but insistent, prompted an immediate response from the housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwell, a stern woman whose loyalty to the family bordered on devotion. "They arrived yesterday, postmarked from London. Lady Eleanor collected them herself, I believe. She mentioned nothing about their contents. She was always secretive. Yes, very secretive. But she never seemed frightened." Marple lifted one of the envelopes delicately, turning it over in her hands. There was a faint scent of lavender, perhaps a residue from some ink or perfume, but nothing else. The handwriting was elegant, almost artistic, and yet the words themselves, once she pried them open, were cryptic, looping sentences that seemed to dance around some hidden meaning. One letter in particular caught her eye. It began with the line, "Some truths are best left unspoken, for their weight may crush the careless soul." She did not need to read further to sense the urgency, the veiled warning in Eleanor's handwriting. And yet strangely the letters were untouched, unopened by anyone other than their intended recipient. Whoever had delivered them, or whatever Lady Eleanor had intended to do with them, had clearly played some part in the current mystery. It was not until she examined the desk more closely that Marple noticed the small, seemingly inconsequential detail. A single smudge of ink on the corner of the desk, as though someone had hastily tried to erase a note, yet left a trace behind. She bent low, inspecting the residue, her sharp eyes catching a faint fingerprint in the residual ink. The print was partial, but it might be a clue, an invitation to dig deeper into the labyrinthine relationships surrounding the Davenport household. The household itself was a gallery of peculiar characters, each shadowed with potential secrets. Eleanor's nephew, young Charles Davenport, had been pacing nervously near the fireplace, muttering about family debts and business failures. Miss Adelaide, the companion who had lived with Lady Eleanor for over a decade, seemed unnaturally composed, yet her hands trembled as she served tea to Marple. Even the staff, who had loyally tended to the household for years, exhibited small but telling signs of anxiety, a flicker of hesitation here, a guarded glance there. Marple's mind began assembling the scene like a jigsaw puzzle, each piece delicate yet essential. She noticed that the clock on the mantelpiece had stopped at precisely 3:15 p.m., a seemingly trivial detail until she realized that none of the servants reported hearing the bell chime in the afternoon. There was no evidence of forced entry, yet Lady Eleanor had vanished. The letters, delivered by ordinary post, contained warnings but no names. The room itself spoke of no struggle, no frantic departure, only an almost ceremonial stillness. It was a conundrum that would have defeated most investigators. The scene suggested both simplicity and impossibility simultaneously. The crime appeared easy to solve, yet impossible to explain. How could someone vanish from a locked room, leaving no trace of their presence beyond a set of letters that seemed both critical and meaningless? Was it a matter of subterfuge, clever deception, or some hidden mechanism of escape? Marple considered the letters again, holding them beneath her nose, breathing in their faint scent. She could almost hear Eleanor's voice, whispering through the ink and paper, the careful loops of handwriting conveying both intelligence and fear. Perhaps the answer lay not in the room itself, but in the messages that had been delivered, and the messages yet to be understood. By evening, the house was filled with anxious conversation and unanswered questions. The servants whispered in corners, the police offered little beyond speculation, and the press had begun weaving fanciful theories. Yet Miss Marple, quietly seated in an armchair near the window, felt a quiet certainty stir within her. The crime, baffling as it seemed, was not beyond understanding. The letters were the key, each carefully sealed envelope a fragment of truth that, when pieced together, would illuminate the mystery. As the shadows deepened across the manor, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Every detail mattered, no matter how trivial it appeared, and she had already begun to see the subtle patterns invisible to others. The crime was unsolvable only to those unwilling to look beyond the obvious, but Marple had long since learned to trust the quiet clues. A smudge of ink, a half-formed fingerprint, the faintest scent of lavender. They were whispers of truth, hiding in plain sight, and soon they would speak loudly enough to reveal the path to Lady Eleanor Davenport. The evening closed in, yet the manor seemed alive with anticipation. Somewhere in the house the missing Lady Davenport remained, her movements hidden, her secrets safeguarded. And as Miss Marple sipped her tea and studied the cryptic letters once more, she realized that this was no ordinary disappearance. It was a puzzle of rare subtlety, one that would test the sharpest minds and demand every ounce of her patience, her ingenuity, and her understanding of human nature. The unsolvable crime for now had begun, but the first threads of its unravelling were already within her grasp. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the afternoon observing the household with quiet attentiveness, as though the walls themselves might whisper secrets if one only listened closely enough. The staff busied themselves with routine chores, yet in every gesture, every hesitant glance, she detected an imperceptible tension. The house, she reflected, had the air of a stage set, perfectly arranged yet betraying tiny incongruities, subtle signs of disturbance hidden beneath the veneer of propriety. While Constable Harris conducted his methodical rounds, checking locks, windows and cupboards, Marple turned her attention to the writing desk once more. The letters lay in an immaculate row, each envelope identical in appearance save for the delicate crescent and star seal. She noticed something almost imperceptible. The second letter from the top bore a faint crease along its side, as though it had been slid hastily from the desk and returned. The crease was shallow, almost insignificant, yet it implied movement, a moment of hurried attention that no one else had remarked upon. Her gaze then shifted to the small ink smudge she had discovered earlier. Under the careful light of a silver desk lamp, she traced the outline with her finger, noting the faint fingerprint embedded in the residue. It was incomplete, but there was a deliberate pressure in certain areas, as though the writer had paused mid-gesture, interrupted by some sudden distraction. Miss Marple leaned closer, comparing the loops of ink to the handwriting on the letters themselves. The patterns suggested more than a casual slip of the hand. They hinted at secrecy, the careful concealment of intention, and perhaps a subtle warning embedded within the physical act of writing. As she examined these clues, she noticed movement in the corner of the room. Miss Adelaide, Lady Eleanor's companion, had been hovering near the fireplace, ostensibly arranging logs, yet her eyes were fixed on the letters. A flicker of unease passed across her features whenever she thought Marple was not looking. The detective's keen eye caught it instantly. She made no comment, only allowed her gaze to linger. Miss Adelaide's composure, already fragile, betrayed a subtle deception, enough to suggest that she knew more than she let on. Downstairs, the household's other members busied themselves in anxious conversation, and Charles Davenport moved restlessly near the windows. Marple noticed that he adjusted his coat repeatedly, as though attempting to conceal some object at his side. Every gesture, she realized, spoke a language of unease that words alone could not convey. When she finally approached him with gentle curiosity, he straightened and offered a strained smile. "I assure you, Miss Marple, there's nothing I need to explain," he said, yet the slight tremor in his fingers betrayed the lie. Marple allowed him a polite nod, making no further accusation. Instead, she returned her attention to the letters and the small inconsistencies in the room. The clock, frozen at 3:15, remained a silent witness, its hands a stark reminder that whatever had transpired had left time itself in stasis. She noted the absence of dust disturbance near the windowsill, a detail others had overlooked, indicating that no one had attempted to exit the room through the French windows. Whoever had been in the room, therefore, had either left by some hidden means or had never left at all. Turning her gaze back to Miss Adelaide, Marple decided to observe rather than confront. She quietly followed the companion into the adjoining sitting room, where sunlight fell on polished furniture and embroidered cushions. Miss Adelaide's hands were trembling now, and she fumbled with a small jewellery box which she had taken from a side table. Marple's sharp eyes noticed the box's contents, an assortment of trinkets, keys and pins, but one small, seemingly unremarkable key caught her attention. It was tarnished, older than the rest, and yet out of place among the newer, polished items. "Miss Adelaide," Marple said softly, her voice almost conversational, "that key, where did it come from?" The woman startled, dropping the box with a soft clatter. I don't know," she stammered. "It's been in the house for as long as I can remember. I never thought to pay it much mind." Marple picked up the key carefully, noting its weight and the intricacies of its design. It was a small skeleton key, one that could easily fit into any number of locks around the manor, yet it seemed unusually familiar, almost as though it belonged somewhere significant, and she could not ignore the way Miss Adelaide flinched when it was mentioned. The reaction was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to an observer trained in human behaviour, it spoke volumes. Returning to the bedroom, Marple examined the desk one last time before retiring to her chair by the window. The letters, the ink smudge, the small key, all were fragments of a story not yet told. She noticed that the curtains, though drawn neatly, bore faint indentations along the fabric, as if someone had grasped them in haste. The sunlight revealed a thin line of dust disturbance along the sill, suggesting that a hand had brushed the surface recently, leaving a trail that almost, but not quite, hinted at an exit or an interaction with the window. As the evening shadows lengthened, Marple's mind began to weave the threads together. The crime was still unsolved, the missing Lady Eleanor still hidden, yet she had begun to discern patterns invisible to others. There was deception in the household, subtle yet pervasive, and every small action, from a tremor in a hand to the displacement of a letter, contributed to a growing picture. The detective realized that the letters themselves were likely the key, both as a record of hidden truths and as a tool deliberately manipulated by someone within the house. At dinner, the household gathered with strained formality, though the atmosphere was electric with unspoken tension. Miss Marple observed the interactions carefully, noting small exchanges. Charles Davenport's fleeting glances toward Miss Adelaide, the slight stiffening of Mrs. Blackwell's shoulders when questions were asked, and the nervous tapping of the young maid's fingers on the edge of her plate. Each micro-expression was a clue, a faint ripple of truth in a pond otherwise frozen by propriety and fear. After the meal, as the servants retreated to their quarters and the house settled into quiet murmurs, Marple took one final tour of the manor. She visited the library, where Lady Eleanor often spent hours reading, and noted a small misplaced volume on the floor. Its spine was cracked, the pages bent, as though it had been removed hastily and then dropped. Inside, tucked between the pages, was a single envelope, distinct from the others, bearing a different seal entirely. The envelope was unmarked, save for the faint initials E.D. Marple's curiosity sharpened. Whoever had left this here had intended for it to be found, or perhaps to be overlooked. She carried it back to the bedroom, laying it carefully atop the stack of letters on the desk. The room, with its locked windows, its frozen clock, and its bundle of cryptic correspondence, now seemed alive with possibility. The first hints of deception had emerged. The small key, the misplaced envelope, the subtle reactions of the household members. Each detail suggested a deliberate orchestration, a careful manipulation of appearances to conceal a truth not yet revealed. Sitting once more by the window, Marple allowed herself a quiet moment to consider the day's observations. The crime, seemingly impenetrable to the authorities, was beginning to reveal its skeleton. The letters were the heart of the mystery, yet the human element, the hesitations, the concealed keys, the faint tremors of guilt, was equally vital. The detective understood that she must now tread carefully, observing without alerting the guilty party, gathering evidence from subtle movements, from whispered conversations, and from the objects that, to ordinary eyes, seemed insignificant. Night fell over Davenport Manor, casting long shadows across the parquet floors and ornate furnishings. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of wood settling and the soft murmur of the wind against the windows. Miss Marple, her keen eyes bright in the lamplight, felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. The investigation had truly begun in earnest, and already the first signs of deception were visible to her discerning gaze. The next moves would be delicate, each observation building toward a revelation that, when it came, would illuminate the hidden corners of the manor and reveal the fate of Lady Eleanor Davenport. Miss Marple awoke the next morning to a still, almost oppressive quiet that had settled over Davenport Manor. The house, for all its grandeur and polished elegance, felt heavy with unspoken anxieties. She dressed simply as usual, and moved through the hallways with careful attention, her eyes noting every slight change from the day before. A chair shifted fractionally, a curtain drawn differently, a picture on the wall tilted by a mere millimetre. Each tiny anomaly seemed to whisper secrets, yet she knew it would take patience and careful questioning to draw them into the open. The first to be summoned was Charles Davenport. He had spent the night restless in his room, pacing the floorboards in the darkness, and when Marple found him in the morning, he greeted her with a courteous but strained nod. "Miss Marple," he began, clearing his throat, "I suppose you wish to ask me about last afternoon. I assure you I hardly know what to say. Lady Eleanor left the room for some air, I believe." He hesitated, his voice faltering just long enough for Marple to sense hesitation. "Lady Eleanor left the room," she repeated, gently tilting her head. "And yet the windows were latched from the inside and the door remained locked. You had the key?" Charles faltered again, adjusting his coat nervously. I may have had it briefly. I didn't see her leave. I only noticed the letters on the desk this morning. I swear, I mean no deception." Marple nodded, noting the tautness in his jaw and the rapidity with which his eyes flicked to the door. He was eager to cooperate, almost too eager, and his eagerness seemed to betray a desire to control the narrative. There was truth in his words, perhaps, but only a partial truth, and she filed away the contradiction for further scrutiny. Next came Miss Adelaide, summoned to sit in the drawing-room. She was a woman accustomed to discretion, yet Marple observed a subtle tremor in her hands, the way she clasped them tightly together as if restraining some confession. "Miss Marple," she began in a measured tone, "I cannot imagine why Lady Eleanor would vanish. She has always been private, yes, but not secretive in a dangerous way. I assure you, I observed nothing suspicious, nor did I hear anything unusual yesterday." Marple raised an eyebrow. "Nothing at all? Adelaide hesitated, biting the inside of her lip. Well, perhaps there was the sound of the letter being delivered, but that is all. I did not see her receive it. I only heard the postman's knock. And I had other duties. I was occupied with the household's arrangements. Her words, precise and deliberate, hinted at a mission. Marple suspected that Adelaide had seen or heard more than she admitted. The careful framing, the over-emphasis on being occupied, suggested that some fragment of the truth was being withheld, though whether from fear, loyalty, or self-interest remained uncertain. Mrs. Blackwell, the housekeeper, was summoned next. She had a commanding presence, the kind that often masks subtler intentions. "I've been in this house for 30 years, Miss Marple," she said firmly, "and I've never seen Lady Eleanor act in a way that would suggest she'd run off, or be taken. She's cautious, thoughtful, and very deliberate. I did notice Charles acting oddly yesterday, but perhaps he's merely anxious over the business affairs of the family." Marple noted the slight inflection in Mrs. Blackwell's voice, the almost imperceptible pause before she mentioned Charles. It was a subtle cue, one that suggested she had considered him as a potential factor, but perhaps sought to shield someone or redirect suspicion. The young maid, timid and fidgeting in the corner of the room, provided yet another version. I was just carrying the silver tray, ma'am," she stammered. "I didn't see anything at all, really. I heard footsteps, but they seemed normal. I didn't notice Lady Eleanor. No." Her gaze darted toward Miss Adelaide, and Marple's keen eye caught the silent exchange, a fleeting glance, a moment of mutual acknowledgement that suggested shared knowledge. The detective scribbled notes in her small book, each contradictory account adding layers of complexity to the case. Charles insisted on a version where he had merely observed. Adelaide carefully evaded specifics. Mrs. Blackwell hinted at Charles' unease while maintaining her allegiance to the household. The maid seemed frightened to speak at all. The stories overlapped, intersected, and diverged, creating a tangled web that demanded careful disentangling. Marple decided to probe further, asking questions in a gentle, indirect manner that encouraged the witnesses to reveal more than they intended. "And the letters?" she asked Miss Adelaide, tilting her head slightly. "Did Lady Eleanor mention their content at all?" Adelaide hesitated, glancing down at her clasped hands. "No. She simply looked at them with a frown. I didn't think to ask. She didn't speak of their meaning." Marple sensed something in the hesitation, a subtle shift in tone that suggested Adelaide knew more. "And the key," Marple continued, referring to the tarnished skeleton key she had discovered the previous evening. "Have you ever seen Lady Eleanor use this?" The woman stiffened, her lips parting briefly before she whispered, I may have seen her handle it once or twice, long ago. I don't know where it fits. It's an old key." Marple allowed the pause to stretch, letting the uncertainty sink in. The old key, the letters, the careful concealment, all seemed intertwined, yet none of the witnesses offered a complete picture. Each revealed fragments, hints, and shadows of truth, while their own words carried tiny inconsistencies that only a practiced observer could perceive. Charles, sensing the growing scrutiny, grew defensive. "I told you everything I know. Lady Eleanor may have received letters, yes, but I didn't interfere. I had nothing to do with her disappearance. I assure you, Miss Marple, you mustn't suspect me unjustly." Marple smiled faintly. His insistence, the overt eagerness to exonerate himself, told her more than a confession ever could. The need to steer attention away often revealed precisely where the guilt, or at least the knowledge, lay hidden. She noted his reaction carefully, contrasting it with the subtle restraint of Miss Adelaide and the composure of Mrs. Blackwell. Each played a part, yet each also betrayed tiny lapses of truth through body language, tone, and choice of words. As the questioning continued, Marple detected a pattern emerging. Those who seemed most forthcoming, the ones eager to explain every detail, were concealing something, while those who offered only fragments were doing so cautiously, perhaps out of fear or loyalty. The contradictions, when viewed as a whole, hinted at a deliberate orchestration. The disappearance of Lady Eleanor was no accident. It was embedded in a network of half-truths and subtle deceptions that required patience to unravel. After hours of careful conversation, Marple retreated to the sitting room by the window, where she could study the household from a distance. The voices of deception, she reflected, were many and varied, each statement a potential key or a cleverly placed misdirection. The detective's mind worked quietly, assembling the fragments, connecting the seemingly disparate accounts, and weighing each tiny anomaly. The letters, the key, the interrupted gestures, all were threads leading toward a hidden design, and Marple knew that before long a single overlooked clue would illuminate the path forward. By mid-afternoon, a new detail emerged that sharpened the investigation. A postman had arrived with a telegram addressed to Lady Eleanor, delivered after the household had gathered for questioning. The message, brief and cryptic, instructed the recipient to meet an unknown party at a nearby estate. Marple examined the telegram carefully, noting the handwriting and the language used. It was deliberately vague, yet it confirmed her growing suspicion. Someone outside the household was involved, someone who had influenced the careful orchestration of appearances within. The investigation was still unfolding, the witnesses' conflicting accounts layering complexity upon complexity. Yet for Miss Marple, the threads were beginning to converge. Each contradiction, each withheld word, and each subtle gesture hinted at a larger design, a network of hidden motives, loyalties, and fears. She could almost see the invisible web being spun through the household, each strand leading to a revelation that would illuminate not only Lady Eleanor's fate, but also the secrets long guarded within the walls of Davenport Manor. Night fell once more, and the house grew quiet, but Marple remained alert, her sharp eyes scanning the flickering lamplight for movement, her ears attuned to the smallest whisper. The voices of deception had been heard, and though the truth remained obscured, she had already begun to discern its shape. Tomorrow she would continue to unravel it, thread by delicate thread, until the hidden design revealed itself fully, and the missing Lady Eleanor's path could finally be traced. Miss Marple rose early the following morning, the manor bathed in the pale light of a damp, misty dawn. The gardens, usually pristine, were streaked with dew, each blade of grass reflecting a delicate shimmer that seemed to mirror the complexity of the household itself. The events of the previous days had revealed hints of deceit and subtle misdirection, but today the detective's focus would turn to the most intricate aspect of any mystery: motive. Greed, jealousy, fear, and old resentments, all the forces that could drive a person to commit an extraordinary act, needed to be untangled carefully, thread by careful thread. She began with Charles Davenport, whose restless energy had drawn her attention from the outset. He had a reputation as a young man of ambition and impatience, eager to inherit the family estate, yet there was more than simple avarice lurking beneath the surface. Marple reflected on the way he had spoken of his aunt with a mix of admiration and irritation, particularly when mentioning the letters. "He is fond of her, in his way," she murmured, "but the prospect of inheritance sharpens even the most respectful devotion." The telegram that had arrived the day before also seemed significant. If Charles had known of it, it could have presented both opportunity and motive. His eagerness to cooperate, coupled with his defensiveness, suggested an awareness of consequences greater than a mere misunderstanding. Miss Adelaide, the long-time companion, presented a different puzzle. Her loyalty to Lady Eleanor was unquestionable, yet loyalty can conceal as much as it reveals. Marple considered the way Adelaide had responded to questions about the letters and the key. The small key, old and seemingly insignificant, might have granted access to private rooms or hidden compartments in the manor, a tool that, in the wrong hands, could unlock secrets far more valuable than money alone. Miss Adelaide's guarded responses implied that she either feared something in the letters or wanted to protect someone else. Perhaps she understood the potential danger of the correspondence and acted to shield Lady Eleanor, or perhaps she had an interest of her own. Mrs. Blackwell, the housekeeper, was not immune to suspicion. 30 years of managing a grand household could create attachments that were protective to the point of manipulation. She seemed to favour Charles subtly, her attention never straying far from the young man's movements. Was it maternal concern, or a deeper investment in the outcome of the estate? Marple could not dismiss the possibility that Mrs. Blackwell's meticulous management of the household allowed her to influence events in ways that might prevent or obscure discovery. Her suggestion during questioning that Charles acted oddly was not merely observation, It was placement of suspicion, yet carefully qualified to avoid implicating herself or others. The maid, timid and anxious, offered motives that were less calculated but no less real. Fear, particularly in the hierarchy of a stately household, could be compelling. The girl's glances toward Miss Adelaide suggested awareness of dynamics she did not fully understand, yet her fear of reprisal might have driven her to act, even inadvertently, in ways that complicated the investigation. Small actions, a misplaced tray, a hesitated step, a moment of silence, could carry consequences disproportionate to intention, and Marple noted the subtle ways the youngest members of the household could tip the scales without conscious malice. With the household assembled, Marple began to map connections and contradictions on a mental web. Letters, keys, gestures, and overheard whispers each represented a thread. Every suspect held multiple possible motives, yet no single motive explained all events. For example, Charles's desire for inheritance could explain eagerness and defensive behavior, yet it did not account for the careful orchestration of appearances, the subtle concealment of the letters, or the mysterious telegram. Miss Adelaide's loyalty explained her guardedness, but why would she risk drawing attention by interacting with the key and envelope? Mrs. Blackwell's protective oversight offered one layer of motive, yet it could not alone account for Lady Eleanor's disappearance. Marple took a walk through the manor's corridors, examining rooms and corners with fresh attention. The library, with its shelves of carefully curated volumes, revealed no hidden compartments. Yet, a faint indentation on one shelf suggested a book had been removed recently. The drawing room displayed nothing overtly unusual, though the arrangement of chairs and personal items subtly shifted from the day before, as if someone had been there in secrecy. Each of these small observations fed into the matrix of motive and opportunity she was assembling. She paused in front of the desk once more, eyes scanning the letters. The second letter, the one with the faint crease, suggested haste. Perhaps Lady Eleanor had handled it herself under duress, or perhaps someone had attempted to intercept it. The telegram added a new layer of possibility. An outside party had interests in her movements, and any internal actors would have been aware of it. Each motive in isolation seemed insufficient. The complexity of the household and the presence of an external instigator hinted at coordinated intentions, overlapping loyalties, and calculated concealment. Marple also considered the influence of jealousy, a motive often underestimated in households where proximity and long acquaintance create simmering resentments. Miss Adelaide had long been a companion to Lady Eleanor, a position of intimacy that might engender envy or subtle possessiveness. Charles' impatience could mask irritation at Adelaide's influence over family decisions, while Mrs. Blackwell's decades-long stewardship might lead her to enforce her own judgments over the household's direction. Even the timid maid could unintentionally reflect the small jealousies and tensions that accumulate over years of rigid hierarchy and understated competition. By mid-afternoon, Marple gathered the household once more, not to confront but to observe, allowing interactions to reveal the hidden motives she suspected. Charles spoke rapidly, attempting to dominate conversation, yet his words were punctuated with defensiveness. Miss Adelaide remained composed but watched him with a guarded intensity, her body language suggesting vigilance. Mrs. Blackwell moved carefully among them, dispensing small reassurances while ensuring that the maid remained on edge, a subtle control of information and attention. Every gesture, every word, now carried the potential to betray an underlying motive, if only one could interpret it with care. Marple's mind traced each possible sequence of events. She considered how greed, loyalty, jealousy, and fear could combine in unexpected ways, creating a matrix in which each suspect might act partially in self-interest and partially under influence from others. One thread led from the letters to the key, suggesting an effort to conceal or protect. Another connected the telegram to movements within the household, implying a coordinated manipulation. The faint smudge of ink, the crease in the envelope, the slight displacement of furniture, all were subtle indicators of actions informed by these tangled motives. She paused by the window, gazing out at the misted gardens, reflecting on human nature and the complex interplay of forces within a household long accustomed to hierarchy and secrecy. No single suspect held a complete narrative, yet each contributed to the mystery in a meaningful way. Lady Eleanor's disappearance, she realized, was not the result of a single action, but a convergence of motives: greed, fear, loyalty, and subtle resentment, each influencing the other, creating a labyrinth in which truth was both obscured and protected. By evening, Miss Marple had constructed a preliminary mental map. Charles's ambition intersected with Mrs. Blackwell's protective oversight. Miss Adelaide's guarded loyalty complicated the internal narrative, and the maid's fear added small but crucial variables. Overlaying these was the influence of an external party, whose telegram suggested that Lady Eleanor's movement was being directed beyond the confines of the manor. The motive maze was vast and tangled, but for the first time Marple could perceive the potential pathways through it, the threads she would need to follow to untangle the deliberate orchestration and reveal the hidden truth. As the household settled into uneasy quiet, Marple sat in her usual chair by the window, letting the faint light of dusk illuminate her notes and sketches. She understood that the day's questioning and observation had revealed patterns, not yet explanations, and that the interwoven motives demanded patience, discretion, and a careful reading of human behavior. The threads were present, the web was complex, and tomorrow would bring further clarity as she continued to trace the subtle, often invisible lines connecting desire, fear, and action within Davenport Manor. The morning sunlight spilled across the drawing-room floor, catching the polished surfaces of Davenport Manor and highlighting the meticulous order that masked the household's underlying tension. Miss Marple, quiet as ever, observed the servants bustling about with an almost theatrical energy, preparing for the arrival of a new visitor. Inspector Graves, who had been summoned from the nearest town upon hearing of the mysterious disappearance. Graves was the sort of man who relied heavily on the visible and the tangible, the evidence one could touch, weigh, and catalogue, a stark contrast to Marple's subtle, intuitive approach. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. While examining the desk in Lady Eleanor's bedroom, the inspector's eyes caught the second letter, the one with the faint crease, and immediately his mind seized upon the crease as a sign of attempted tampering. "Here!" he exclaimed, holding it aloft. "This letter has been disturbed. Someone tried to interfere with it. Clearly, we are looking at internal meddling." The household stirred with sudden energy at the declaration. Charles Davenport, his anxiety barely contained, stiffened, while Miss Adelaide's carefully composed demeanour faltered for the first time. Mrs. Blackwell offered a subtle frown, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, and even the maid appeared to hold her breath. The inspector, interpreting the reactions as corroboration, launched into a confident pronouncement. "Clearly," he continued, "the disappearance of Lady Eleanor is linked to whoever tampered with this letter. Internal interference. I suspect one of you tried to manipulate the situation. Based on motive and opportunity, it's apparent who it must be." He turned toward Charles, whose face paled beneath the morning light. "Young man, your ambition is well known. Your eagerness to inherit the estate, coupled with your access to the room, makes you the primary suspect. Your actions yesterday, defensive, evasive, and overly eager to cooperate, point directly to you." Charles opened his mouth to protest, but the inspector continued, oblivious to the subtleties that Marple had already noted. "We'll recover Lady Eleanor shortly, I'm sure. A simple confrontation and some admission of guilt, and the matter will be closed." The household collectively exhaled, relief mingling with tension. Charles, red-faced but trying to mask his fear, denied everything vehemently, yet the inspector's certainty cast a long shadow over his words. To all outward appearances, the case seemed nearly solved. Lady Eleanor would be found, the letters would be explained, and the young man's culpability would close the circle neatly. But Miss Marple, seated quietly by the window, felt the familiar stir of unease. Something about the inspector's theory, while superficially convincing, did not align with the subtler patterns she had observed. The crease in the letter could suggest tampering, yes, but the action had been deliberate and cautious. If Charles had acted in haste, one might expect other signs of panic or recklessness, yet the room remained nearly undisturbed, the letters otherwise untouched. The partial fingerprint in the ink smudge did not match him either. The handwriting on the letter bore no trace of his involvement. A false victory, she realized. Graves was satisfied with a convenient narrative, but the truth rarely conformed so neatly to expectation. Marple allowed the inspector to proceed, making careful notes as he interrogated the household further. Miss Adelaide, despite her composure, now exhibited a subtle restraint that suggested she knew more than she would admit. She answered the inspector's questions, careful to avoid revealing anything truly significant, yet her eyes occasionally flickered to the desk, the letters, and the key in ways that betrayed attention to details others had overlooked. Marple noted these small signals with precision. The tension in her companion's posture hinted at deeper awareness, perhaps even complicity, though in what sense remained to be determined. The housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwell, offered corroborating testimony to the inspector's theory, emphasizing Charles' ambition and eagerness. She highlighted his nervous glances, his defensive demeanor, and his proximity to the letters. Yet Marple observed subtle contradictions. Mrs. Blackwell had spoken the day before of the importance of observing the household carefully, and now her testimony seemed crafted to align with the inspector's assumptions rather than the facts. She was protective, not just of Charles, but of the household's reputation, and her manipulation of perception was almost imperceptible. The maid, too, seemed relieved by the inspector's focus on Charles, though Marple detected the briefest flicker of recognition in her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that the explanation being presented was too tidy, perhaps convenient for someone else. Fear, Marple realized, could be as compelling a tool as ambition or greed. The young girl's silence had been carefully cultivated, her small gestures revealing the threads of truth only to an observant eye. As the inspector prepared to secure Charles for questioning and further proceedings, Marple quietly requested a moment with him alone. She allowed him to speak freely, encouraging confidence and honesty. "Young man," she said gently, "tell me exactly what happened yesterday. You need not fear me or the inspector. Speak plainly." Charles exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I swear, Miss Marple, I did nothing. I did not touch the letters, nor did I interfere with her room. I only tried to observe, perhaps too eagerly. I wanted to know if she was safe. I feared something might have happened, and I was foolish to involve myself so openly." Marple nodded, her expression patient. She had suspected as much. The eagerness and defensiveness, while suspicious to the untrained eye, had been consistent with genuine concern rather than malice. Yet, if Charles was innocent, then the true culprit remained at large, hidden, observing, waiting. The inspector returned to announce that the case was effectively solved, his confidence radiating across the room. "We have identified the likely suspect," he proclaimed, "and with further questioning, Lady Eleanor will undoubtedly be located. There is no further cause for alarm." Marple remained silent, though a faint crease of concern furrowed her brow. Graves's declaration, though satisfying to the authorities and the household alike, lacked the subtle calibration of truth she had learned to recognize. Something in the patterns of behavior, in the careful placement of letters, in the guarded reactions of Miss Adelaide and the housekeeper, suggested a deeper orchestration. Whoever had truly caused Lady Eleanor's disappearance had ensured that suspicion fell elsewhere, conveniently, convincingly, and almost flawlessly. As the afternoon wore on, Marple revisited the letters, the key, and the partial fingerprint in the ink smudge. She traced each small irregularity, reconstructing the sequence of interactions that had occurred in the bedroom and adjoining rooms. One subtle observation crystallized in her mind: the crease in the letter, the careful tampering, the seemingly random displacement of items, all suggested intention rather than accident. The person responsible had deliberately crafted a scenario to mislead the authorities, allowing the case to appear solved while they remained in the shadows. By evening, Marple had drawn a quiet conclusion. The outwardly apparent breakthrough was a false victory. The real criminal was patient, intelligent, and aware of how to manipulate perception. They had orchestrated appearances, guided suspicion, and carefully concealed their involvement, all while leaving the household in a state of anxious confusion. Graves's triumph, she realized, was superficial. The truth lay hidden beneath layers of subtle deception, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Miss Marple settled into her chair by the window, the fading light illuminating the neatly stacked letters and the tarnished key. The house was calm, almost serene, yet she felt the underlying tension as acutely as ever. The inspector's premature victory had illuminated only one facet of the mystery, leaving the true orchestration unseen. Somewhere in Davenport Manor, or perhaps outside its walls, the real culprit lingered, observing, manipulating, and preparing for their next move. As night deepened, Marple's mind traced the threads of the puzzle. She considered motives, hidden alliances, and subtle manipulations. The false victory, while superficially comforting to the household and the authorities, had merely set the stage for the next development. Patience, careful observation, and a sharp understanding of human nature would be essential. The real criminal remained concealed, waiting for the moment when confidence and complacency would allow them to strike again. And when they did, Miss Marple knew she would be ready. Miss Marple awoke. Before dawn, the mist, still thick over Davenport Manor, curling around the topiary like wisps of a secretive memory. She sat quietly in her room with a steaming cup of tea, reflecting on the day's developments. The false victory, the inspector's premature certainty, it all pointed to a pattern she had seen too often. Criminals confident in the authority of conventional reasoning, confident that the truth would remain obscured by assumptions. Her mind wandered, as it often did in such cases, to forgotten details, overlooked incidents, and the lives of those involved long before the present crisis. The detail that had eluded everyone until now was small, almost trivial, yet Marple had noticed it the moment she first examined the letters. The faint scent of lavender lingering on one envelope. Most would have dismissed it as perfume paper or a house fragrance. But she remembered something from long ago, a case she had followed in her youth involving a seemingly minor household scent that had led to the revelation of a concealed liaison and, ultimately, a long-standing grudge. Could a similar connection exist here? She resolved to revisit the history of the manor and the lives of its inhabitants with renewed attention. By mid-morning, she had requested a quiet meeting with Mrs. Blackwell. The housekeeper had been in Davenport Manor for 30 years, and in that time she had overseen generations of the family with meticulous care. Mrs. Blackwell, Marple began gently, I wonder if there are any old grievances or incidents that may still linger in the household. Sometimes the present is shaped by the past in ways we overlook. The housekeeper stiffened slightly, a flash of discomfort crossing her otherwise composed expression. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple, she said carefully. The house has had its disagreements, of course, but nothing of real consequence. Lady Eleanor has always been the dutiful, cautious sort, and I have tried to keep the household in order. Surely no one here holds ill will that could result in this? Marple studied her, noting the subtle avoidance of her eyes and the faint tightening around her mouth. Sometimes the past isn't obvious, she said softly. Old debts, old slights, forgotten conflicts. They often leave traces in unexpected ways. Even the most loyal servants can carry memories, whether of injustice or fear. Mrs. Blackwell paused, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. There was once an incident, many years ago, she admitted finally. A distant cousin of Lady Eleanor, Edward Davenport, was involved in a disagreement over the family estate. It was never spoken of publicly, and the matter was supposedly resolved quietly. But Edward had a reputation for holding grudges. He left the household abruptly, though he visited occasionally under the guise of polite family business. It never seemed important at the time, but perhaps it should have been, remembered differently. Marple nodded, her mind already spinning connections. And these visits? Did anyone else in the household have particular interactions with Edward? Anything unusual in their behaviour? Mrs. Blackwell hesitated. Miss Adelaide. She seemed uneasy in his presence. She was very loyal to Lady Eleanor and perhaps wary of any influence that might undermine her. But I cannot say more than that. It seemed proper for a companion to maintain composure. The mention of Adelaide, coupled with the old tension over Edward, sparked a recollection in Marple's mind. The hidden key, the careful handling of letters, the subtle gestures of guarded secrecy, all could relate to concerns or threats rooted in past family dynamics. She realized that Lady Eleanor's disappearance might not be solely about the present, nor about immediate ambitions. It could be a culmination of old resentments, misplaced trust, and lingering influence from a previous generation. She spent the afternoon examining household records, genealogical notes and letters stored in the library. Among the mundane records, one small envelope, previously overlooked, revealed a note of correspondence from Edward Davenport to Miss Adelaide, dated several years prior. Its tone was formal, but contained hints of personal entreaty and subtle persuasion, suggesting a close and somewhat manipulative relationship. Marple's heart quickened. Here was the thread connecting two people whose behaviour in the present had seemed independent. Edward Davenport, long absent, and Miss Adelaide, whose loyalty had been tested repeatedly over the years. Later, during a careful walk through the manor, Marple observed the servants at their chores and noticed the subtle interactions among them. The maid still glanced frequently at Miss Adelaide, though with less fear than before, suggesting she had been privy to fragments of long-held household knowledge. Even Charles' restless energy seemed moderated when near certain rooms, as though he too was aware of unspoken histories that informed the present tension. The entire household, she realized, was intertwined with echoes of past events, each individual's present behavior shaded by old connections, grievances, or secrets. Marple requested a private conversation with Miss Adelaide that evening, ensuring that no one else overheard. The companion greeted her with composed politeness, yet the slightest tension around the shoulders betrayed awareness of what was coming. "Miss Marple," she began, "I trust you have discovered something you wish to discuss." Marple held her gaze gently. "Yes, I believe the past may be influencing the present more than any of us have considered. Your interactions with Edward Davenport, were they as innocuous as they appeared, or was there more at play?" Adelaide's fingers twitched briefly over the fabric of her dress, and her eyes flickered with momentary alarm. "Edward? He was persuasive, yes, but long ago I was cautious and loyal to Lady Eleanor. She stopped herself, her composure returning, though her voice carried a faint strain. "I do not understand how this concerns the current situation." Marple leaned forward, her tone gentle but precise. "The letters, the key, the subtle concealment, all suggest deliberate orchestration. Someone aware of household history, capable of manipulating appearances, could exploit old alliances and fears to create a false narrative. Your past interactions with Edward may have provided knowledge that someone is now using to orchestrate Lady Eleanor's disappearance." Adelaide exhaled slowly, her composure faltering just enough to reveal genuine concern. "You mean someone is using history against her? Against us?" "Yes," Marple replied softly. "The crime is not just about inheritance or ambition. It has roots buried in the past, drawing on connections and secrets that have long been overlooked. To solve it, we must consider not only present motives but also the influence of people and events that have shaped this household for decades." Marple spent the rest of the night reviewing the letters and the key, correlating the faint crease and smudged ink with the newly uncovered connections. She traced how Edward Davenport's past manipulations and Miss Adelaide's historical entanglements could have been exploited by a present actor, someone observing, waiting, and using the collective knowledge of the household to orchestrate a disappearance that would mislead even experienced investigators. By the following morning, the detective felt the first true clarity of the case emerging. The crime was no longer an isolated act, but a continuation of history, a carefully constructed pattern rooted in old loyalties, long-held grievances, and subtle influence. The motives intertwined across generations, the secrets of the past influencing the choices of the present, and the once-overlooked details, the faint scent of lavender, the prior correspondence, and the subtle reactions of household members, now shone as critical pieces in the puzzle. Miss Marple knew that the shadows of the past were not merely background. They were the very mechanism by which the present had been manipulated. Lady Eleanor's disappearance was the culmination of a long, intricate chain of events, with each participant, aware or unaware, playing a role in an orchestrated deception that extended far beyond immediate motives. The detective, calm and focused, resolved to trace these historical threads with patience and precision, for only by understanding the past could she illuminate the present and unmask the true orchestrator of the mystery. Miss Marple had long learned that the human mind often betrayed itself when confronted with subtle, carefully orchestrated prompts. By the following morning, The manor was steeped in a tense stillness, the air thick with the residue of whispered speculations and half-truths. She resolved to employ an unconventional tactic, one that did not rely on force or formal interrogation, but on observation, suggestion, and gentle provocation, the tools with which the most careful deception often unravelled. She invited the household into the drawing-room once again, but this time with a different purpose. No accusations would be made, no assumptions stated. Instead, she prepared a small experiment designed to reveal how each individual responded to suggestion and observation. On a side table, she placed a few letters, some unopened, some deliberately creased or smudged, alongside the tarnished key she had already examined. Each item was carefully chosen, not merely for its physical presence but for the associations it carried, symbols of trust, loyalty, secrecy, and ambition. As the household gathered, Marple began speaking in a calm, almost conversational tone. "You know," she said softly, allowing her words to drift without targeting anyone specifically, "sometimes people respond to objects in ways they do not even realize. A key, a letter, even a faint scent can provoke reactions, gestures, expressions, hesitation that reveal more than words ever could. I find it fascinating how subtle clues can unlock memories or truths hidden from our conscious awareness." Her statement was casual, almost idle, but the effect was immediate. Charles Davenport shifted uneasily in his chair, glancing at the letters with a quick, anxious movement that suggested awareness or anticipation. Mrs. Blackwell's fingers tightened around the arm of her chair, the faintest furrow appearing between her brows. The maid, who had been quiet throughout, glanced nervously at Miss Adelaide before looking down at her folded hands. And Adelaide herself remained outwardly composed, yet there was a micro-expression, a slight narrowing of the eyes as they fell on the tarnished key, that betrayed something beneath her carefully maintained calm. Marple allowed the silence to stretch, then continued. "I wonder," she said thoughtfully, "what people would do if asked to place an object where it felt right to them, without any guidance or instruction. A key, for instance. A letter. Sometimes the placement of a small object can reveal preferences, associations, or even guilt." Carefully, she invited each member of the household to engage with the exercise, framing it as a casual experiment to test one's intuition and memory. One by one, they moved the letters and the key about the table, arranging them with gestures and expressions that seemed natural, yet to Marple's trained eye, each was weighted with subtle intent. She observed how Charles placed the creased letter slightly away from the key, a gesture of avoidance or discomfort. Mrs. Blackwell aligned a letter deliberately in parallel with the key, almost as if seeking control or balance in an uncertain scenario. The maid hesitated for longer than anyone else, then placed her letter far from the rest, as though distancing herself from perceived danger. It was Miss Adelaide who reacted in a way that finally revealed a subtle crack in her deception. When asked to place the key, she paused for an unusually long time, her fingers hovering above it with a faint tremor. Then, almost imperceptibly, she pressed it against the creased letter before placing it carefully in the centre of the table. The act seemed deliberate, calculated, yet the micro-expression that crossed her face, an almost imperceptible flash of alarm, quickly masked by composure, betrayed the faintest anxiety. Marple noted this quietly. She understood that a reaction such as Adelaide's, subtle as it was, could indicate either an internalized fear, a sense of guilt, or a concealed knowledge that connected the key to the letters and ultimately to Lady Eleanor's disappearance. To the untrained eye, her composure remained flawless, but in truth, this minor slip was a critical insight, a reflection of the hidden orchestration at play. Seizing the moment, Marple asked the household to recount their actions during the previous day, but with an unusual constraint. They were to narrate only what they remembered instinctively, without premeditation or explanation. The goal was simple yet revealing. Truth often surfaced more readily when the mind was compelled to act without forethought. Charles spoke first, his words consistent with earlier accounts, but tinged with nervous energy. "I observed from the hallway," he said, "but I did not touch anything. I wanted to ensure she was safe." His gestures were hesitant, his gaze flickering toward the letters and key. Mrs. Blackwell emphasized order and oversight, framing her actions as protective rather than manipulative. "I merely ensured that the household remained proper and in sequence," she said, her tone calm, though Marple detected subtle emphasis on proper, an effort to assert control and legitimacy. The maid predictably provided fragmented recollections, often trailing off or hesitating, revealing little concrete evidence but hinting at awareness of actions she feared to recount fully. Her instinctive narrative, however, revealed small truths, a step taken in the wrong place, an object shifted inadvertently, that corroborated minor anomalies Marple had noted previously. When it was Adelaide's turn, Marple observed her closely. The companion recounted her day with precision, yet her hands occasionally drifted to the key or the letter as she spoke, almost unconsciously repeating gestures made earlier. Her voice, measured and calm, carried no overt admission, yet the repetition of motion, a subtle mimicry of prior action, betrayed a psychological resonance with the object itself. She was clearly connected to the orchestration in a manner she did not wish to reveal. Marple allowed the exercise to conclude before addressing the household directly. "Thank you," she said gently. "I asked for instinct, and instinct has its own honesty. Often it tells us more than words, explanations, or rehearsed statements. Patterns emerge when we observe how people interact with objects, how they react to suggestion, and how they behave when the mind is unguarded. Subtle reactions reveal the connections we might otherwise overlook." The effect was immediate. Adelaide's composure wavered just slightly, a faint constriction of her eyes and a brief hesitation before she resumed her posture. Marple recognized it as the crack in the carefully maintained facade, an almost imperceptible signal that something within the companion's past interactions or current awareness intersected directly with the crime. The detective now had a concrete thread to follow, linking objects, gestures, and psychological response to motive and opportunity in a way that no mere testimony could achieve. As the household dispersed, each member occupied with their routines, Marple remained seated by the table, her eyes scanning the letters and key. The unconventional tactic had succeeded. She now possessed evidence not written in ink or recorded in paper, but inscribed in behaviour itself. The crack in Adelaide's carefully maintained calm suggested knowledge or involvement, however indirect, and provided the first tangible lead in unravelling the deeper orchestration of Lady Eleanor's disappearance. Marple reflected on the method she had employed. Conventional reasoning and procedural diligence had yielded only false certainty. The inspector's triumph had been superficial. Yet by observing instinctive behaviour, by introducing subtle psychological prompts, she had uncovered a fissure in the deception, an entry point into the hidden design. From this subtle revelation, the detective could begin to reconstruct the chain of events, isolate hidden motives, and anticipate the next move of a criminal who had hitherto remained invisible, waiting for the perfect moment to act. As night fell and shadows crept through the corridors of Davenport Manor, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, satisfied smile. The unconventional clue, a tremor in a hand, a hesitation, a repeated gesture, had opened a window into the hidden truth. The game was far from over, but she now held a vital key, a glimpse behind the carefully constructed masks, revealing cracks in the deception that would, in time, lead to Lady Eleanor's safe recovery and the unmasking of the one who had orchestrated her disappearance. The morning air was crisp and still as Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, the letters and key neatly arranged on the polished table. She had spent the previous night reviewing her notes, tracing the subtle psychological cues and gestures that had revealed a crack in Adelaide's composure. The insight felt like the first foothold on a steep cliff, small but vital. Today she intended to consolidate what she had learned, reviewing the correspondence and cross-referencing the interactions she had observed, but the manor had its own plans. Upon entering the room, Marple immediately noticed a subtle disturbance. The key was missing. She froze, eyes narrowing as her mind raced. Only moments before it had rested in the centre of the table. Now the small, tarnished object, a linchpin in her understanding of the case, was gone. The letters, which had been carefully organised, were scattered, some creased anew as though hastily handled. Marple's pulse quickened, though her outward demeanour remained calm. The deliberate displacement of evidence was unmistakable, a clear signal that someone was working against her, someone determined to manipulate the investigation before the truth could surface. She knelt to examine the table closely, noting faint smudges in the wood, subtle fingerprints not her own. The intruder had been careful, but not careful enough for her trained eyes. She called the household together immediately. Charles, Mrs. Blackwell, Miss Adelaide, and the maid gathered in the room, each expressing surprise, though the subtleties of their expressions told different stories. Charles' face paled. He looked genuinely concerned, yet also flicked glances toward Adelaide as if seeking confirmation. Mrs. Blackwell's hands tightened over her apron, her composure strained. The maid fidgeted, eyes darting nervously from one adult to another. And Adelaide, for her part, remained outwardly calm, but the micro-expression Marple had noted the previous day now returned with sharper intensity, a flash of alarm, almost imperceptible before her face smoothed into polite neutrality. Inspector Graves arrived shortly after, summoned in haste. He immediately began a thorough search of the drawing-room and adjoining corridors, while Marple observed quietly, her mind piecing together the significance of the vanishing evidence. Graves, confident in his procedural rigour, seemed reassured by the search, though he failed to notice the faint inconsistencies in the household's reactions. Marple began by questioning the maid privately. The girl was frightened, nearly trembling, but under gentle coaxing she revealed something significant. I saw someone in the corridor last night," she admitted softly, moving quietly toward the drawing-room. "I couldn't see their face, my candle flickered, but it wasn't one of the adults I usually see moving at that hour." Marple considered this carefully. The intruder had clearly acted under cover of darkness, avoiding detection. It was unlikely that a servant would have had the confidence or motivation to handle the letters and key in such a deliberate manner. The evidence had not been merely disturbed, it had been specifically removed and manipulated. Her attention then returned to Adelaide. The subtle signals she had observed, tremors, hesitations, repeated gestures, now gained a new significance in light of the missing key. Marple understood that the companion's composure was not necessarily proof of guilt, but it suggested a familiarity with the mechanisms of concealment and an awareness of how evidence could be manipulated to mislead. Someone within the household knew precisely how to control perceptions. The letters themselves offered additional insight. Some had been moved, their creases deeper, as if handled with intent, while one had been placed in an unusual position, partially obscured beneath a stack of books. Marple recognized this as an attempt not only to obscure the content, but to create a false narrative, suggesting to any observer that the tampering had occurred in a haphazard or impulsive fashion rather than with deliberate orchestration. As the day wore on, Marple retraced every route within the manor, examining doors, hallways, and even the servants' quarters. She found faint traces of dust disturbance near a seldom-used side entrance, suggesting a clandestine passage through which someone could move unnoticed. The intruder had been deliberate, precise, and informed, a manipulator who understood both the physical layout of the manor and the psychological tendencies of its occupants. Charles and Mrs. Blackwell were cooperative, yet Marple noted the subtleties in their behaviour, the way Charles avoided direct eye contact when discussing the key, the way Mrs. Blackwell's posture tightened when she mentioned household routines. The maid's account was fragmented, but consistent with someone observing movement from a distance, and Adelaide's quiet demeanour, punctuated by minor micro-expressions, suggested an understanding of the intruder's methods and the potential consequences of the stolen evidence. By evening, Marple gathered the household once more, not for confrontation, but to observe reactions. She casually mentioned the missing key and the disturbed letters, framing it as an unfortunate accident of carelessness. "It is remarkable," she said, "how easily important items can vanish or be misplaced, even under the watch of vigilant eyes. One must always wonder who might benefit from such incidents, intentional or otherwise." Her words elicited responses that were subtle yet telling. Charles shifted uncomfortably, clearly anxious but careful not to incriminate anyone directly. Mrs. Blackwell's hands flexed briefly, a silent tension. The maid stared, wide-eyed, uncertain how to respond, and Adelaide, though composed, momentarily betrayed a flicker of unease in the form of a slight tightening of her jaw and a brief downward glance, a non-verbal acknowledgement that the matter affected her more than she could openly admit. Marple understood then that the theft or manipulation of evidence was not merely opportunistic, it was strategic. Someone was actively working to prevent discovery, to bury the truth before it could be fully revealed. The intruder's knowledge of the household, combined with their awareness of human behavior, allowed them to create a temporary smokescreen, manipulating perceptions while leaving only subtle clues that a trained observer could detect. The detective spent the night reviewing patterns, considering who might possess both the access and the insight necessary to execute such a precise act. It was clear that the intruder was not acting randomly, but with intent, shaping the investigation itself to mislead authorities and delay the revelation of Lady Eleanor's whereabouts. The missing key, the displaced letters, and the faint traces of movement through the corridors were more than mere physical anomalies. They were psychological signals, deliberate markers designed to test reactions and influence conclusions. By the next morning, Marple had pieced together a tentative understanding. The stakes had risen. Trust within the household was fragile, as each member now realized that someone among them, or intimately familiar with their routines, was capable of deliberate manipulation. The vanishing evidence had shifted the balance of the investigation, introducing uncertainty and urgency. Any premature assumptions would now be dangerous, potentially allowing the true orchestrator to consolidate their advantage further. Marple, seated quietly by the window with the letters spread before her, reflected on the delicate interplay of human behavior, opportunity, and strategy. The thief or manipulator had revealed themselves not through overt action, but through subtle orchestration, leaving just enough trace to be recognized by an observant mind. The detective knew that the challenge now was to follow these faint traces, interpret the hidden signals, and anticipate the next move of someone willing to act with precision and cunning to conceal the truth. The manor, so calm in appearance, was now a stage of hidden contests, whispered intentions, and unseen manoeuvring. Miss Marple understood that the theft of evidence was not merely a setback, it was a calculated escalation. The criminal remained at large, intelligent, patient, and deeply aware of the investigative methods being employed against them. Only through patience, observation, and careful deduction could the layers of deception be peeled back, revealing not just the missing key or letters, but the intricate network of motives and secrets that had brought Davenport Manor to this precarious brink. As night fell once more, Marple allowed herself a measured sense of anticipation. The vanishing evidence had raised the stakes, but it had also illuminated the sophistication of the adversary. Each subtle clue, each overlooked detail, now carried greater significance. The true resolution of Lady Eleanor's disappearance would require keen insight, careful strategy, and the patience to watch for the faintest of signals in a household alive with secrets. The dawn was pale, filtered through the tall windows of Davenport Manor, casting long, hesitant shadows across the polished floors. Miss Marple had been awake long before sunrise, reviewing the scattered clues from the previous day, the missing key, the disturbed letters, and the subtle micro-expressions that had revealed cracks in composure. Her mind was a web of connections, threads tracing both past and present, yet she knew better than to assume the path forward would be straightforward. Her intuition was proven correct before the household had even gathered for breakfast. A sharp, panicked cry echoed through the corridors, a sound that immediately sent a shiver through the still morning air. Marple rose slowly, her heart tightening, and followed the sound toward Lady Eleanor's private sitting room. There, the scene that greeted her was one of chaos and dread. The maid, trembling, pointed toward the open window. The heavy velvet curtains billowed as if alive, and scattered papers littered the floor. But it was the absence of Lady Eleanor that froze the detective in place. The young lady had vanished entirely, leaving behind only an overturned chair, a faint smear of blood along the windowsill, and the unmistakable scent of lavender, her signature perfume, faint but suddenly ominous. Marple's mind raced. The initial disappearance had seemed orchestrated, already complicated by the vanishing key and the manipulated letters. But now the stakes had escalated dramatically. Someone was active within the manor, capable of swift, precise, and daring action. The villain had struck again, and this time the threat was immediate and physical. Inspector Graves arrived moments later, summoned by the maid's frantic cries, and immediately began issuing orders. Officers were dispatched to search the grounds, the surrounding gardens, and the nearby stables. Marple observed quietly, noting the inspector's urgency but also the lack of attention to subtle cues. Graves was focused on the obvious: footprints, doors ajar, missing persons. He missed the faint telltale signs of calculated misdirection, the deliberate placement of papers, the shallow smear of blood intended to suggest panic, and the careful avoidance of any marks on the floor that might indicate forced entry. Marple, however, detected patterns in the chaos. She knelt by the window, examining the sill and surrounding area. The faint traces of mud from shoes, the direction of the curtains, and the arrangement of scattered papers suggested not random flight, but deliberate manipulation. Lady Eleanor's disappearance had been staged with precision, indicating the villain's awareness of the investigation, the detective's presence, and even the reactions of household members. She turned to the maid, speaking softly to avoid alarming the household further. "You said you saw someone moving through the corridors last night?" The girl nodded, eyes wide. "Yes, Miss Marple. A figure. I could not see their face, but they moved quietly, deliberately. I think they intended to take Lady Eleanor. They went straight to her room." Marple's mind worked swiftly, drawing connections. The previous manipulations, the letters, the key, the disrupted objects, had all been steps in a larger plan. The villain had not acted randomly. Each action had been calculated, shaping perception and misleading authorities. The escalation to a direct abduction confirmed a pattern. The criminal was several steps ahead, using psychological insight and careful planning to orchestrate the crime. She requested a moment alone with the household, framing it as a precautionary discussion rather than a confrontation. "We must assume," she said carefully, "that the person responsible is still within or near the manor. The previous incidents, displaced letters, missing key, subtle manipulations, were not isolated. They were intended to test reactions, divert attention, and now, it appears, to escalate to more serious action. We cannot afford to act without careful observation." Charles Davenport's face drained of colour. "Do you mean," he began, voice shaking, "that they might strike again? Or that Lady Eleanor is in danger?" Marple nodded. "Both. The escalation is clear. Whoever is behind this is confident, patient, and capable. They understand how we think, how the household behaves, and how to manipulate perception. Our task is now not only to solve the mystery, but to prevent further harm." The inspector, frustrated by the lack of immediately actionable evidence, pressed for immediate physical searches. "We need to canvass the grounds, check the servants' quarters, and question anyone who may have seen or heard something unusual," he insisted. But Marple knew the urgency required more than brute force. Observation, understanding human behaviour, and anticipating the villain's strategy were paramount. Marple focused on Adelaide, whose composure had always been carefully maintained, yet subtle reactions now betrayed more than ever. The companion's hands fidgeted briefly with a handkerchief, eyes momentarily darting toward the open window as if assessing an escape route. Her gestures suggested awareness, not necessarily guilt, but knowledge of the layout, the timing, and the manipulation of household routines. Marple filed this insight carefully. It would inform the next steps in tracking the perpetrator. In the hours that followed, the search extended to every corner of the manor and the surrounding estate. Officers combed through stables, outbuildings, and gardens, noting footprints and marks of entry, yet all signs pointed to a careful, deliberate plan. No obvious struggle, no hasty footprints, no forced entry. It was clear that Lady Eleanor had been led or coerced rather than seized violently, another layer of sophistication in the villain's methods. Marple began to reconstruct the sequence. The initial disappearance had been staged to mislead the authorities, the letters and key manipulated to create a false narrative. The abduction, or sudden disappearance, of Lady Eleanor itself was the next step in a calculated escalation, designed to test reactions, elicit panic, and expose the vulnerabilities of those attempting to investigate. Each action was deliberate, designed to maintain control of the narrative and remain several steps ahead of any conventional investigation. By evening, the detective implemented a precautionary strategy. She arranged the household in carefully observed patterns, placing herself in the most strategic locations, and instructed the maid and other servants to maintain visible presence while subtly monitoring movements. Every corridor, doorway and window became an opportunity for observation. Marple's mind traced the sequence of psychological manipulations, anticipating where the villain might strike next, which rooms they would approach, and what methods they might use to evade detection. The night deepened, bringing with it a palpable tension. Each flicker of shadow, each creak of the floorboards was amplified in Marple's mind as potential movement by the criminal. She reviewed the letters and notes, considering the subtle cues embedded in their placement, the lingering scent of lavender, and the reactions she had observed in Adelaide. The interplay of past grievances, present manipulation, and escalating threat suggested that the villain's strategy was not merely to conceal Lady Eleanor, but to maintain psychological dominance over the household and the investigation itself. In the stillness before midnight, a faint sound reached Marple's ears, a soft rustle near the back corridor, followed by the shadow of movement. She rose quietly, her senses alert, and slipped toward the sound. Her mind anticipated the possibilities: a servant misplaced in the search, a hidden animal, or, most dangerously, the criminal moving to escalate the situation further. The suddenness of the moment crystallized the danger. The villain was active, intelligent, and unpredictable, willing to manipulate perception, evade authorities, and escalate to abduction. Miss Marple understood that the case had shifted dramatically. No longer could she rely solely on deduction or observation of subtle behavior. She must now prevent harm directly, anticipate the next move, and remain several steps ahead in a deadly game of strategy. The unexpected twist, the sudden disappearance, had transformed the investigation. It was no longer merely a puzzle of letters, keys, and household secrets. It had become a race against time, a test of intellect, patience, and courage. Miss Marple, calm yet resolute, prepared herself to navigate this sudden escalation. The criminal was still at large, but now, for the first time, Marple had the insight and determination to confront not only the mystery, but the threat itself, seeking both the recovery of Lady Eleanor and the unmasking of a cunning and relentless adversary. The morning sun crept across Davenport Manor with a tentative glow, but inside tension lingered thick in the air. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, eyes resting on the scattered letters and the faint traces of recent chaos. Lady Eleanor's disappearance had shifted the investigation into urgent territory. The theft of evidence and the abduction had all been calculated, deliberate, yet the criminal's next move remained hidden. Marple sipped her tea slowly, her mind weaving together threads of the past few days. Letters manipulated, keys removed, gestures observed, and subtle micro-expressions. The pieces of the puzzle seemed disparate, almost chaotic. But Miss Marple knew better. She had learned long ago that the most cunning criminals often left patterns in plain sight, embedding their movements, motives, and manipulations in small, seemingly insignificant details. Her attention returned to a detail that had lingered in the back of her mind, a peculiar comment from Charles Davenport during the earlier questioning. He had mentioned, almost casually, that Lady Eleanor had been fond of checking her correspondence first thing in the morning, even before breakfast. The remark seemed trivial at the time, just a minor note about habit, but Marple now saw it differently. The villain had been observing, orchestrating events to exploit predictable behavior. Lady Eleanor's routine, previously overlooked, provided the perfect window for manipulation. Marple rose and moved through the manor, tracing the household's morning patterns. She watched the maid place tea on the side table, Mrs. Blackwell arranging linens, and Charles moving toward the study. The repetition, the subtle rhythms of daily life, all seemed ordinary, until Marple noted the alignment of minor discrepancies. The letters had been shifted in a way that correlated to Lady Eleanor's habitual routines. The missing key, the displaced papers, even the faint smear of blood near the windowsill, they were all part of a deliberate choreography designed to exploit human predictability. A quiet laugh escaped her lips, almost involuntarily. So obvious, and yet hidden in plain sight, she murmured to herself. The pattern emerged not in grand gestures or dramatic events, but in minutiae. Gestures repeated, habitual behaviours, and slight inconsistencies between what was expected and what occurred. Each small act, each overlooked comment, was a thread in a tapestry woven by someone with intimate knowledge of the household. Miss Marple began to focus on Miss Adelaide. The companion's calm composure and subtle reactions had always suggested awareness, perhaps involvement, but now Marple considered it under a new light. Adelaide had known the routines, observed interactions, and understood where influence could be exerted. Her previous micro-expressions, the trembling hand, the hesitation with the key, the repeated gestures when recounting actions, now aligned perfectly with the emerging pattern. The subtlety of Adelaide's movements, once dismissed as careful propriety, suddenly seemed like strategic observation. Marple requested the household to gather again, framing it as a discussion of daily habits and routines rather than a confrontation. "Sometimes," she said gently, "the most revealing clues are hidden in our ordinary actions, in the small, repeated behaviours we hardly notice ourselves. A gesture, a habit, a turn of phrase, these can point to what is truly happening behind the scenes." She observed carefully as each member recounted their morning routines. Charles spoke of walking past the library before breakfast, noting nothing unusual. Mrs. Blackwell described arranging linens and overseeing the household. The maid reported the usual tasks, and Adelaide, while precise and composed, subtly adjusted the positioning of her hands, glanced toward the side table where letters had been previously arranged, and lingered slightly on her description of Lady Eleanor's habits. Marple's mind traced connections. The abduction had occurred during a routine, the letters manipulated to suggest misdirection, and the missing key was part of a pattern exploiting habitual behaviours. The criminal had not only orchestrated the disappearance, but had also used predictable routines to minimise the risk of detection, creating the impression of chaos while retaining control. A critical realisation struck her when she considered the timing of the letter's manipulation. Each letter had been moved in a sequence corresponding to Lady Eleanor's typical morning route. First the study, then the drawing room, then the side table by the window. The pattern of displacement mirrored her habits, suggesting that the perpetrator had meticulously mapped her movements. The missing key had been removed precisely at the moment she would reach for it, ensuring both physical and psychological leverage. Marple also revisited the small detail of the scent of lavender, previously noted but thought trivial. It had persisted in certain locations while being absent in others, suggesting a deliberate use of scent to manipulate perception and create subtle cues. Combined with gestures, object placement, and habitual routines, it became a signature of the criminal's methods, a psychological signature embedded in ordinary settings. The detective's gaze shifted to the side corridor leading to Lady Eleanor's sitting room. The faint marks on the floor, the direction of furniture displacement, and the placement of scattered letters all formed a trajectory, a path that reflected not only movement, but intention. The criminal had anticipated both Lady Eleanor's responses and those of the household, designing each act to maintain dominance while concealing the ultimate objective, the abduction. Marple considered motives anew, now informed by the pattern she had uncovered. The manipulations were not random. They had been executed with intimate knowledge of the household's inner workings and of each person's behavioural tendencies. Greed, jealousy, or revenge were only pieces of a larger puzzle. The villain had been orchestrating events for maximum effect, using predictability as a weapon and psychological insight as a shield. She walked through the manor again, visualizing the sequence of events in her mind. First, the letters subtly shifted, testing observation and reactions. Next, the key disappeared, creating uncertainty and providing leverage. Finally, the abduction was staged during a routine moment, exploiting predictable habits and pre-existing knowledge of behaviours. Each act seemed isolated until now. Together they revealed a meticulous, deliberate strategy. Her thoughts returned to Adelaide. The companion had been present for every step of this emerging pattern, aware of routines, capable of subtle influence, and always maintaining composure. Yet the pattern revealed something deeper, a calculated reliance on others' predictable responses, the ability to manipulate perception without overt action, and an intimate understanding of the household's rhythms. Miss Marple's mind traced the connections, noting how previous micro-expressions now aligned perfectly with the criminal's methodology. By midday, the detective had mapped the pattern clearly. She could anticipate the next likely moves, locations the villain might target, objects likely to be manipulated, and the psychological triggers being exploited to maintain control. The key to unravelling the case had been in plain sight all along, not in dramatic clues or overt misdirection, but in the small, consistent details that revealed habitual patterns and predictable responses. Marple's satisfaction was quiet, yet profound. The chaos, the stolen evidence, the abduction, they were no longer random. They were all part of an orchestrated pattern, one that she could now follow, understand, and ultimately use to bring the investigation to a resolution. The criminal's cleverness had been formidable, but insight, observation, and an understanding of human nature had illuminated the path forward. As she prepared her next steps, Marple reflected on the lesson embedded in the emerging pattern. The key to a mystery often lay not in what was immediately dramatic or sensational, but in the mundane, the habitual, and the seemingly insignificant. A gesture, a comment, a scent, or a habit. These could form the very skeleton of truth upon which a carefully constructed deception rested. By recognizing these subtleties, the detective had transformed apparent chaos into clarity, and the road to Lady Eleanor's recovery and the exposure of the villain lay within reach. The air in Davenport Manor was thick with anticipation. Miss Marple had spent the night poring over the pattern she had uncovered, replaying sequences in her mind, connecting gestures, movements, and habits into a coherent path. She now understood the methodology behind the abduction, the carefully timed manipulations, the subtle psychological provocations, and the exploitation of predictable behavior. Yet the question that had lingered like a shadow all along remained. Why? Why had someone gone to such extreme lengths to orchestrate these events, to manipulate the household, and to abduct Lady Eleanor? Marple began her morning by revisiting every piece of correspondence, every subtle gesture, and every remark she had observed in the household. Her mind sifted through conversations, micro-expressions, and overlooked habits, seeking a link that went beyond simple greed, jealousy, or revenge. These motives had been present, certainly, but they felt insufficient to account for the meticulous orchestration of events. The crime carried an emotional and psychological weight far more complex than anyone had suspected. She summoned Charles Davenport for a private conversation, framing it as a discussion of his observations rather than an interrogation. Charles, pale and tense, recounted once more the series of unusual occurrences, the misplaced letters, the missing key, the subtle reactions of Adelaide. As he spoke, his words carried an unintentional emphasis, revealing his own anxieties about the household's inner workings. Marple listened carefully, noting his selective recollection, his avoidance of certain details, and the faint hesitation whenever Adelaide's name arose. It was then that a faint memory struck her, a casual remark from Adelaide during the first days of investigation. She had said, almost in passing, "Sometimes people hide behind appearances, Miss Marple, and yet the truth clings to them like a shadow. One can see it if one knows how to look." At the time, Marple had noted it as a clever observation, perhaps merely a reflection of her companion's intellect. Now, however, it took on a new significance. The statement suggested an awareness of concealment and revelation, a consciousness of the way truth and deception intertwined. Marple decided to confront Adelaide directly, inviting her to the study under the guise of reviewing household routines. The companion entered with her usual composure, yet the faintest flicker of apprehension passed across her features as she took her seat. "Adelaide," Marple began gently, "we have seen how small actions, repeated gestures, and predictable routines can be manipulated. I wonder, in your experience, what compels someone to go to such lengths, not simply for material gain, but to control, to orchestrate, to dominate." Adelaide's eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly. She adjusted her posture and replied with measured calm. "Control? Some people fear chaos more than anything else. They cannot bear unpredictability, Miss Marple. To them, orchestrating events, even extreme ones, is a way of maintaining order, of imposing a sense of logic upon a world they find frighteningly random. Marple's mind raced. The explanation was psychological rather than financial or social. The criminal was not merely motivated by greed or revenge. They were driven by a compulsion, a need to manipulate, to control, to see events unfold according to a precise design. The meticulous displacement of letters, the missing key, and the timed abduction were not just tactical, they were expressions of a deeper, almost obsessive need to create a perfect sequence of events. She probed further. And what of the emotional cost, Adelaide? Surely such measures demand risk, deception, and harm to others. What drives someone to accept these consequences? The companion's gaze faltered for just a moment, and her voice softened. Some fears are primal, Miss Marple. Some minds cannot tolerate uncertainty, so they impose certainty by force, through manipulation, deception, and control. The object is not gain, nor vengeance alone. It is the creation of a world where chaos is minimized, where one can predict every outcome, even if it requires extreme measures. A chill ran down Marple's spine. She had long understood human nature, but the revelation of motive in its purest form, the intersection of fear, obsession, and the need for control, was both illuminating and unsettling. It explained why the crime had unfolded with such precision, why the criminal had remained steps ahead, and why each act had been calculated to exploit both habits and perception. The abduction, the displaced letters, the stolen key, everything had been a manifestation of this compulsion. Marple returned to the scattered evidence, the letters, the faint traces of movement, and the subtle manipulations she had observed. Each detail now carried not just a tactical significance, but a psychological one. The perpetrator's obsession with control had dictated the placement of objects, the timing of actions, and the selection of moments for observation. The villain's understanding of human behavior and their ability to anticipate reactions was born from a need to orchestrate a world in which unpredictability was neutralized. It became clear to Marple that Adelaide's prior gestures, the hesitation with the key, the micro-expressions, the repeated subtle actions, were not merely habitual, but indicative of knowledge, awareness, and proximity to the mind orchestrating events. The companion's intellect and insight had allowed her to understand the criminal's methods, if not the full extent of the compulsion driving them. Marple recognized the thin line between awareness and complicity, understanding that knowledge without direct intervention could be as perilous as participation. The detective's thoughts turned to Lady Eleanor's disappearance. The pattern of manipulation, the precise timing, and the careful orchestration of household routines were all expressions of the villain's need to control outcomes. Every move had been designed to provoke reactions, test perceptions, and ultimately ensure that events unfolded according to the criminal's psychological design. The abduction was not merely an act of coercion or threat, it was the climax of a sequence born of obsessive compulsion, a demonstration of mastery over both environment and human behavior. Marple reflected on the broader implications. The criminal's psychology had dictated the entire sequence of events, transforming ordinary objects and routines into instruments of manipulation. Letters became tools of misdirection, keys symbols of control, and habitual behaviors mechanisms for predicting and influencing reactions. The crime was as much a study in human behavior as it was a physical act, revealing a mind compelled to orchestrate, to dominate, and to impose order on a world perceived as threateningly unpredictable. By late afternoon, the detective felt she had grasped the full scope of the hidden motive. The revelation was profound. The crime was not a simple matter of greed, envy, or vengeance. It was a manifestation of psychological compulsion, a need to impose absolute control over events, people, and perception. Understanding this motive reframed the investigation, allowing Marple to anticipate the criminal's next move, interpret subtle behavioral cues, and predict the points of vulnerability in the orchestration. She convened the household one final time that evening, not for confrontation, but to observe. Each member's demeanour, gestures and expressions were carefully noted. Charles' anxiety, Mrs. Blackwell's controlled tension, the maid's uncertain glances, all were interpreted in the context of the villain's psychological framework. Adelaide, for her part, maintained composure, but Marple now saw her awareness, subtle movements, and occasional micro-expressions as reflections of knowledge rather than complicity, a key factor in understanding how the crime had been executed and how it could now be unravelled. In the quiet of the manor, Miss Marple allowed herself a measured sense of clarity. The hidden motive, the compulsion to control and orchestrate events with obsessive precision, had illuminated the mystery in a way that no conventional deduction could. It explained the sequence of manipulations, the missing evidence, and the abduction, providing insight into both methodology and psychology. The revelation of motive gave her the final piece of the puzzle, understanding why someone had gone to such extremes, why they had exploited habitual behaviours, and why each act had been meticulously calculated. With this knowledge, she could anticipate the criminal's next move, safeguard Lady Eleanor, and ultimately bring the perpetrator to justice. As the manor settled into an uneasy calm, Miss Marple's mind was already tracing the next steps, preparing to confront the intricate web of compulsion, deception, and control. The villain's psychology had been exposed, revealing a depth and intensity far beyond ordinary motives. But with insight, patience, and observation, the detective was now positioned to turn the tide, restore order, and uncover the truth hidden behind the carefully orchestrated chaos. Miss Marple's plan had taken shape with careful precision, each detail considered, each possibility anticipated. She had spent hours reviewing the household routines, the subtle gestures of the suspects, and the emerging psychological pattern that had revealed the villain's compulsive need to control events. Now, with Lady Eleanor's safety still uncertain, and the criminal poised to strike again, the detective knew the time for careful observation had passed. It was time for the final confrontation. The drawing room had been arranged deliberately. Chairs were positioned strategically, windows slightly ajar to allow for controlled observation of movement outside, and the letters that had once been scattered were carefully placed to recreate the sequence that had drawn Marple's attention to the villain's manipulations. Every object, every minor detail, was part of a carefully constructed stage, a trap designed not with brute force but with psychological insight. She invited the household to gather under the pretense of reviewing the morning's routine, though in truth her focus was singular, to provoke a response from the villain while maintaining her own composure. Each person took a seat, the air thick with anticipation. Charles Davenport's hands fidgeted with his handkerchief. Mrs. Blackwell's posture was rigid, and the maid's eyes darted nervously from one adult to another. Adelaide entered last, her usual calm tempered by a subtle tension, though she tried to mask it beneath polite deference. Marple began the conversation gently, as if discussing mundane matters, recounting observations of the household over the past days. "It is remarkable," she said softly, "how often we overlook the smallest details, gestures, habits, routines that might reveal truths far greater than appearances suggest. Sometimes the most telling information is hidden in plain sight." Her words, carefully measured, were aimed at Adelaide. The companion's micro-expressions flickered almost imperceptibly, an eyebrow raised, a slight tightening of the jaw. Marple allowed the moment to hang, giving the smallest pause to encourage reaction. Then, almost casually, she mentioned Lady Eleanor's disappearance. "It was during her morning routine, of course," she said, "that the sequence of events took a dangerous turn. Letters moved, objects shifted, and the predictability of human behaviour was exploited. It was not a violent act in the conventional sense, but a demonstration of control, an orchestrated attempt to dominate perception and action." A faint gasp escaped the maid, but it was Adelaide who stiffened. Her hands, previously steady, now clutched her lap with tension. Marple observed every nuance, noting the signs that indicated recognition and awareness. "You see, my dear," Marple continued, "the person responsible is meticulous, aware of habits, and understands how subtle manipulations can create maximum effect. It is a mind driven not by greed or revenge alone, but by an obsessive need to control, to orchestrate events perfectly. One might even call it a compulsion. Adelaide's composure faltered. She shifted in her seat, and her gaze momentarily met Marple's directly before darting away. A small, almost imperceptible sigh escaped her lips. The detective held her calm demeanour, allowing the tension to build. She knew that pressure and observation, when applied carefully, could prompt a confession or at least a revealing reaction. Charles shifted uncomfortably. You think it could be—" His voice faltered, and he looked at Adelaide. The companion's hands twitched, brushing against the folds of her dress, an almost invisible gesture that betrayed the careful control she usually maintained. Marple spoke quietly, deliberately, guiding the conversation without accusation. "I have studied the sequence of events, the manipulation of letters, the missing key, the patterns of movement within the manor. Everything points to someone who understands both the physical environment and the predictable behavior of those around them. A mind that relies on observation, foresight, and careful orchestration to achieve its ends." Adelaide's breathing quickened, though she attempted to mask it. The detective waited, letting the tension linger, observing how the companion's subtle gestures revealed mounting anxiety. Then Marple leaned forward slightly, voice soft but steady. "And yet, even the most careful orchestration cannot account for the human capacity for observation. Details, no matter how small, can betray intent. A hand tremor, a shift in posture, a fleeting glance. These are the cracks in the mask." The companion's eyes widened slightly. Her lips parted as if to speak, then closed again, hesitation clear in every micro-movement. Marple maintained her composure, allowing the weight of observation to press gently but insistently. Finally, Adelaide's defences began to crumble. Her voice, measured at first, faltered. You understand," she whispered. "More than I thought possible." She looked around the room, eyes darting nervously, as though considering escape, then returned to Marple with resignation. "Yes," she admitted, voice trembling. "It was me. I never intended for it to go so far. I only wanted to ensure that nothing unpredictable could harm her, or us. I believed if I controlled the circumstances, I could protect everyone. But I misjudged the consequences." Marple nodded gently, listening intently. "You acted out of compulsion, a need to control, not from malice or greed. You believed your orchestration would prevent harm, yet the extremes you employed created risk instead. The letters, the key, the abduction, they were all part of your design, executed with meticulous precision, yet, ultimately, human unpredictability intervened." Adelaide's shoulders slumped, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. She had anticipated confrontation, perhaps even suspicion, but the calm, analytical approach of Miss Marple had stripped away the need for defence. She had confessed not out of threat, but because the truth could no longer be contained. Marple continued, guiding the confession toward resolution. "Understanding the compulsion does not excuse the danger it caused, but it explains the meticulous planning, the subtle manipulations, and the careful orchestration of events. You sought to impose order upon chaos, yet in doing so, you endangered the very people you hoped to protect." The room remained still, the weight of revelations settling over the household. Charles and Mrs. Blackwell exchanged glances. The maid remained tense, and Adelaide, now exposed, seemed smaller, stripped of the calm authority she had carefully cultivated. Miss Marple rose gracefully, addressing the group. "The danger is past, and the truth has emerged. What remains now is the acknowledgement of actions, and the careful steps necessary to ensure safety going forward. Lady Eleanor will be recovered, the household restored, and the manipulations that caused such anxiety will be understood and rectified." Inspector Graves entered at that moment, summoned by Marple's discreet signal. He listened as the companion admitted to her orchestration, finally comprehending the psychological compulsion that had driven the chain of events. The inspector, though initially taken aback, followed procedure, while Marple's composed presence ensured that the revelation remained controlled and the household calm. As the day drew to a close, the tension in Davenport Manor gradually eased. The villain, now fully revealed in motive and method, had been confronted, the chain of manipulations understood, and the immediate threat neutralized. Miss Marple, ever composed, reviewed the events quietly, satisfied that every piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The missing letters, the key, the abduction, and the subtle psychological manipulations had all been accounted for, understood, and confronted. In the quiet that followed, Marple reflected on the unfolding of the case. The villain had been several steps ahead, exploiting predictable behavior, habitual routines, and the human tendency to overlook small details. Yet the insight, patience, and careful observation of a trained detective had illuminated the truth, revealing both the compulsion behind the acts and the methodical execution that had masked it. Adelaide, seated quietly and resigned, now faced the consequences of her actions, but Marple's approach ensured that the revelation was framed within understanding rather than condemnation alone. The criminal's psychology had been exposed, the chain of events unravelled, and the household, though shaken, was safe once more. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, private sigh of satisfaction. The final confrontation had required patience, insight, and the careful orchestration of observation. Every gesture, every reaction, every detail had been part of the puzzle, and now, at last, the intricate web of manipulation and compulsion had been laid bare. The manor had settled into a fragile calm. Lady Eleanor was safely restored to her rooms, the household had begun its cautious routines once more, and Adelaide, still pale and withdrawn, had confessed to orchestrating the abduction. On the surface, the case seemed closed, the villain revealed, the motive explained, and the pattern unravelled. Inspector Graves had begun filing his reports, satisfied that the mystery had reached its conclusion. Miss Marple, however, felt a familiar tug in her mind, the subtle, insistent sense that something still lay beneath the surface, a detail overlooked, a shadow lingering where it should not. She wandered through the corridors of Davenport Manor that evening, examining the objects and locations involved in the prior events. Her eyes, trained to notice what others ignored, lingered on the small remnants of the abduction sequence, a faint scuff near the window frame, the subtle misalignment of a chair, the letters still slightly out of order. Most would see only residual disorder, but Marple sensed a discrepancy that did not fit the narrative Adelaide had provided. Something, or someone, had been manipulating events behind the scenes, beyond the reach of her confessed accomplice. Her intuition was confirmed later that night, when she reviewed the household accounts with Charles. Among receipts, logs, and records, she noticed an anomaly, a series of notes regarding deliveries and visitors that did not correspond with anyone in the household, or at least anyone they knew. The entries were minor, seemingly bureaucratic, almost clerical, but Marple's trained mind recognized a deliberate insertion of information meant to obscure rather than illuminate. Someone had left a breadcrumb trail that suggested normalcy while hiding an irregularity only she could detect. She decided to confront this quietly, summoning Adelaide to the drawing room under the pretense of reviewing the confession one last time. Adelaide entered with the same subdued composure, but Marple's gaze, calm and unwavering, immediately drew her attention. "You confessed," Marple said softly, "and your actions, while extreme, were understandable in light of your compulsion for control. But there is something here," she tapped gently on the ledger of household records, "that does not align with the sequence you described." Adelaide's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Her hands twitched ever so slightly, betraying a tension she had not yet revealed. "The deliveries," Marple continued, "the irregular notes in the household account. Someone else has been active, orchestrating elements beyond your reach. I believe these entries are not errors or oversight. They are the signature of another mind, one even more cunning than the sequence you designed." For a moment, Adelaide's composure faltered completely. I thought I had accounted for everything," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I did everything myself. I controlled it all." Marple leaned forward, her voice calm but insistent. "That is precisely the illusion, my dear. Control can be imagined, and yet unseen influences can intervene. Look at the pattern again, the letters, the timing of the abduction, even your own movements. Someone else had the foresight to anticipate your design, to manipulate outcomes subtly so that suspicion might fall on you while the real architect remained in the shadows. Adelaide's eyes widened, fear mingling with confusion. Another person?" she asked. "Yes," Marple confirmed, eyes narrowing slightly as she considered the implications. "Someone who observed both your compulsions and the household routines, someone clever enough to orchestrate events without leaving overt traces. They used your actions to create misdirection, to hide their presence until the last moment. And I believe," she paused, letting the weight of her insight settle, "that this person is closer than anyone suspects, someone within Davenport Manor itself." The revelation struck Adelaide visibly. Her fingers trembled against her lap, and her composure, carefully maintained for days, began to unravel. It cannot be," she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. "Who could it be?" Marple allowed a small pause, letting the psychological pressure build without forcing a direct accusation. "Consider the subtle cues, the gestures we may have overlooked, the interactions that seemed insignificant. Think of the comments, the shifts in posture, the questions that appeared casual but carried weight. There is one among you who has observed, calculated, and waited. Someone who is not immediately obvious, yet whose influence has shaped every move, every perception, every moment of chaos and resolution." The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock, each second amplifying the tension. Even Charles Davenport, who had been eager to restore order, now looked uneasy, sensing the shift in Marple's tone. Mrs. Blackwell's rigid posture did not falter, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. The maid clutched her apron nervously. Every household member now felt the subtle weight of suspicion pressing upon them. Marple rose, moving with deliberate calm toward the window, her eyes scanning the courtyard and the surrounding estate. "The person I speak of," she continued, "is someone whose presence has been constant, yet unobtrusive. They have allowed Adelaide to act, observed how her compulsions could be manipulated, and then subtly altered outcomes so that blame, perception, and attention would fall where they desired. Their genius lies in invisibility, appearing as ordinary, as harmless, while orchestrating events from behind the curtain." A shiver ran through the household. No one spoke. The detective's gaze returned to Adelaide, who looked stricken with disbelief. "It cannot be," she said again, voice trembling. I thought I was the master of this design." "Indeed," Marple replied, "but mastery is often an illusion. Control can be assumed, yet unseen hands can guide, shape, and redefine outcomes. The real mastermind," she said, stepping closer to the companion, "is someone who thrives on observation, subtle influence, and the orchestration of perception. And in Davenport Manor, the clues were in plain sight, gestures, reactions, and habits, signals that only a careful observer would notice." The tension reached its apex as the household realized the depth of deception. Adelaide's confession, though sincere, had been manipulated, exploited by someone with greater patience, foresight, and subtlety. The idea that the crime was closed evaporated. The shadow in the room, until now unseen, had shifted the investigation into a new phase. Marple's mind raced, tracing interactions, timing, and reactions with methodical precision. Who had observed, waited, and subtly intervened? Who had ensured that Adelaide's compulsions became a tool for misdirection, while the true architect remained hidden? The answer was there in the gestures, the slight hesitations, the faint micro-expressions she had catalogued, but not yet fully interpreted. And then it became clear, a detail almost imperceptible, but now glaringly obvious. A glance exchanged between Mrs. Blackwell and the maid during the discussion, a subtle adjustment of a brooch that had drawn attention days ago, a casual remark about routines that had seemed mundane. These were not accidents. The real mastermind had been shaping perceptions all along, leveraging the obsessive need for control, the habitual routines and the psychological manipulations of both the household and the confessed accomplice. Marple's voice, steady and resolute, delivered the final blow of revelation. The crime, the abduction, and the chaos were orchestrated by more than one mind. The individual who truly guided these events, the one who remained several steps ahead, has been in plain sight, hidden behind the mask of ordinary behavior. And now, with the truth illuminated, there is no place left to hide. The room erupted in shocked murmurs, eyes darting between faces, everyone realizing that the resolution they had accepted as final was, in fact, incomplete. The last-minute twist had shattered the illusion of closure, revealing the brilliance, subtlety and audacity of the true mastermind. Miss Marple, calm as ever, allowed the tension to settle just enough for observation, prepared to act decisively to unmask the person whose genius had nearly escaped detection entirely. The case, which had seemed solved, was now renewed with urgency. Yet Marple's composure, insight, and methodical patience ensured that she remained several steps ahead. The hidden manipulations, the shadowed influence, and the true psychological brilliance of the villain would finally be confronted, and justice, meticulously applied, would not be denied. The manor had descended into an uneasy quiet, the kind that carries the residue of revelation and the weight of unanswered questions. Miss Marple stood in the centre of the drawing-room, her gaze sweeping the assembled household. The previous night's revelation that the true mastermind had been operating unseen, exploiting Adelaide's compulsions and the household's routines, had left everyone shaken. Tension lingered like a thick fog, and Marple knew that the final resolution depended not only on observation but on timing, on guiding events so that the truth could no longer hide. She began by revisiting the sequence of events with careful precision. The letters had been shifted not haphazardly, but along the path Lady Eleanor followed each morning, a detail Adelaide had used to create misdirection. The missing key had served not merely as a tool of control, but as a lure, diverting attention while the mastermind manoeuvred from behind the scenes. Even the subtle scent of lavender, previously dismissed as incidental, had been a psychological signal, designed to evoke calm or distraction in moments that demanded precise observation. Every small detail, every gesture, every habitual routine had been orchestrated to conceal the influence of the unseen hand. Marple turned her attention to the individual she now knew had been orchestrating the events from the shadows. Mrs. Blackwell's rigid posture, her measured speech, and the careful way she had overseen household affairs had all been indicators of presence rather than mere propriety. Her keen observation of the household, the slight manipulations of timing and positioning, and the subtle steering of attention were hallmarks of someone accustomed to control without exposure. Yet, the detective recognized that Mrs. Blackwell had not acted alone. The accomplice, Adelaide, had provided unwitting support through her obsessive need to orchestrate outcomes, her compulsion creating the perfect cover for the true mastermind's influence. Marple addressed the household, her voice calm but commanding. The events of recent days have revealed the extraordinary lengths to which one mind can go to impose order upon chaos, to manipulate perception, and to orchestrate events according to its own design. But even the most cunning schemes leave traces, hidden in gestures, in habits, in seemingly trivial interactions. It is these traces that have allowed the truth to emerge. The room was silent, each member of the household acutely aware that Miss Marple was not merely recounting events, but pointing to the subtle signs they themselves had overlooked. Charles Davenport's eyes widened slightly, while Adelaide remained pale, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mrs. Blackwell, composed yet alert, maintained her usual mask, though a faint tremor betrayed the strain of exposure. Marple moved deliberately, enumerating the overlooked clues that had led to her insight. The letters, she began, were shifted along Lady Eleanor's path each morning, creating the illusion of random displacement. The key, removed at the precise moment to provoke uncertainty, was not simply a tool of compulsion but part of a broader design. The scent of lavender, the placement of furniture, the micro-expressions and gestures, each element has significance. To the casual observer, they were incidental. To the trained eye, they formed a map, a pattern, a psychological signature. Her gaze settled on Mrs. Blackwell. "It was you," she said quietly but firmly, "who recognized Adelaide's compulsions and used them to manipulate outcomes from behind the scenes. Your orchestration was subtle, hidden behind a veneer of propriety, yet every gesture, every adjustment, every observed habit was part of your plan. The abduction, the missing letters, the theft of the key, these were not simply the result of Adelaide's compulsion, but the product of your careful guidance. Mrs. Blackwell's composure faltered, her lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time she seemed uncertain. You cannot prove," she began, voice faltering. Marple interrupted gently yet firmly. "Proof lies not only in confession but in observation. Your micro-expressions, the subtle cues, the alignment of gestures and timing, they all point to your influence. You underestimated human observation and overestimated the effectiveness of subtle manipulation, yet the traces remained, and they have led us here." The household held its collective breath. The air was thick with the tension of revelation, each person aware of the stakes. Adelaide's hands shook as she looked toward Mrs. Blackwell, realization dawning that she had been a pawn, her own compulsions exploited by the true mastermind. Charles and the maid exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of how to intervene, but aware that the careful balance of observation had shifted. Marple allowed a moment for the weight of her words to settle, then continued. "Understanding the mechanics of the crime allows us to see both the consequences and the responsibility. The abduction, the manipulations, the chaos. They were orchestrated to maintain control, yet they exposed the very vulnerabilities the orchestrator sought to conceal. Recognition of patterns, observation of subtle cues, and attention to seemingly trivial details have brought the truth to light." Mrs. Blackwell's gaze darted toward the door. There was a sudden, instinctive movement, a final, desperate attempt at escape. But Marple had anticipated this, and Inspector Graves, previously stationed discreetly outside, stepped forward, with calm authority, preventing any flight. The household collectively exhaled as the tension shifted from anticipation to resolution. The truth had been fully revealed. Mrs. Blackwell's influence had been masked, her subtle manipulations hidden in plain sight, yet the meticulous attention of Miss Marple had unravelled the web. Justice, though delayed and complicated by the layers of psychological intrigue, had been served. The abduction and manipulations had been addressed, and the household could now begin the slow process of restoration. Yet, even as the case reached its conclusion, Marple noted the lingering shadows, the faint traces of manipulation that had gone undetected, the potential for influence that even a brilliant detective could not always foresee. There was an unsettling sense of unfinished business, a reminder that human nature, compulsion, and cunning could never be entirely contained. The criminal's genius had been countered, yet the subtlety of human behavior remained a constant, unpredictable factor in the tapestry of life. Marple gathered the household one final time, summarizing the hidden clues and their significance. "Every detail," she said, "even those overlooked, contributes to the understanding of events. Gestures, routines, micro-expressions, and habits, all were integral to the unfolding of this mystery. Observation, patience, and attention have allowed the truth to emerge, revealing not just actions but the motivations behind them. It is a testament to the need for careful perception and the insight to connect what at first seems unrelated." The household listened, absorbing the detective's explanation, recognizing the brilliance and precision that had uncovered a level of orchestration far beyond initial appearances. Lady Eleanor, now safely returned to her familiar routines, nodded quietly, a mixture of relief and lingering unease in her expression. Adelaide, though shaken, had been guided toward understanding the consequences of her actions, while Mrs. Blackwell was taken into custody, her quiet genius for manipulation finally accounted for. As the evening shadows lengthened across Davenport Manor, Miss Marple reflected on the resolution. The case had demanded observation, psychological insight, and patience, revealing the intricate interplay of compulsion, manipulation, and human behavior. Justice had been served, but the subtle, pervasive nature of cunning ensured that the lesson remained. One must always look closely, observe carefully, and trust in the power of insight to reveal what is hidden in plain sight. Marple allowed herself a faint, satisfied smile. The household, though shaken, was safe, the abduction resolved, and the hidden manipulations exposed. Yet, the lingering awareness of human unpredictability and the possibility of unseen influence left a quiet, reflective tension, a reminder that while justice could be delivered, the world remained a place where subtlety and cunning could always shape events in ways few could anticipate. The morning after the final revelations, Davenport Manor had returned to a semblance of its usual rhythm, though the air remained tinged with an unspoken tension. The household moved through its routines carefully, as though each step might betray a hidden truth, and every glance carried the weight of recent discoveries. Lady Eleanor had resumed her morning walks in the garden, her composure restored, but her expression shadowed by the ordeal she had endured. Adelaide, subdued yet more introspective than before, assisted quietly, her earlier compulsions tempered by the sobering realization of manipulation and consequence. Even Charles Davenport moved with a measured caution, aware that the events of recent days had revealed vulnerabilities in the familiar and trusted. Miss Marple, however, experienced none of the tension that hung over the household. Her mind, always alert, had already begun its subtle work, tracing threads and patterns invisible to most. Yet as she prepared to depart, a small, nagging detail insisted upon her attention. It was so minute that it might have escaped the notice of any ordinary observer. A single letter, tucked beneath the fold of an envelope she had thought accounted for, with the ink slightly smudged, the handwriting elegant but unfamiliar. A message, perhaps meant to be incidental, or perhaps left intentionally. Its meaning was not immediately clear. She picked it up, weighing it between thumb and forefinger, turning it over as her sharp mind assessed the implications. The envelope had arrived days before, at a moment that seemed insignificant, yet it now resonated with a subtle weight. A faint impression of a seal, though broken, suggested secrecy. The words, partially obscured, hinted at a concern or warning that had been overlooked amid the frenzy of the unfolding events. "Observe the shadowed path, the hand unseen," it read, the phrasing cryptic but suggestive, almost teasing the intellect. Marple's lips curved into a faint knowing smile. The note was not a threat, it was a challenge, a reminder that even in cases concluded, there are always layers unseen, threads that twist beyond the perception of ordinary attention. She folded it carefully, placing it within her notebook alongside the other notes she had accumulated throughout the investigation. The message would remain with her, a silent prompt to observe, to anticipate, and to remain vigilant, as the world was never fully as it seemed. As she gathered her coat and gloves, the household members approached with expressions of gratitude, relief, and lingering curiosity. Lady Eleanor spoke first, her voice gentle but firm. "Miss Marple, we owe you more than words can convey. How did you see through all the layers, the letters, the compulsion, the hidden orchestration?" Marple's eyes twinkled with the quiet amusement of someone accustomed to the subtle intricacies of human behaviour. "It is not always a matter of what is seen, Lady Eleanor, but what is observed. Small gestures, slight inconsistencies, and patterns repeated too often can reveal much about intentions, even when the actors themselves are unaware. The human mind leaves traces as surely as footprints in sand, and careful observation allows those traces to be read." Charles Davenport, still grappling with the shock of recent revelations, asked, "And the mastermind, the accomplice, have we truly seen the last of them?" Marple's gaze lingered briefly on Mrs. Blackwell, now removed from the household, her expression unreadable. "We have accounted for the immediate danger," she said carefully, "but the mind that orchestrates from the shadows may always find subtle ways to influence events. That is why observation must be continual, and understanding must remain keen. Justice can address deeds, but the intellect behind them may linger, waiting for opportunity." Even Adelaide, subdued but composed, murmured an acknowledgement, her earlier compulsion tempered by a dawning awareness of vulnerability. She had seen firsthand how a mind driven by subtle control could manipulate perception, yet she also recognized that insight and observation could counteract even the most meticulous of designs. Marple stepped onto the manor's sweeping terrace, the cool morning air brushing against her face. The garden beyond shimmered with dew, each leaf reflecting the soft light of the rising sun, and she allowed herself a moment to breathe deeply, observing the household from a distance. Everything appeared calm, ordinary even, but she knew that appearances were often deceptive. The note she carried, the lingering questions in the back of her mind, and the faint, almost imperceptible cues she had observed all suggested that the world and human behaviour would continue to offer mysteries. She walked slowly toward the carriage awaiting her, mind attuned to the subtle interplay of detail and perception that defined her work. The manor receded behind her, yet the echoes of recent events remained, the psychological traces of manipulation and compulsion woven into the household's routines like invisible threads. Even in departure, she was aware that observation never truly ended. There was always another gesture to interpret, another pattern to decode. As the carriage rolled along the country lane, Marple's thoughts returned to the small letter. Its cryptic phrasing hinted at unseen movements, a subtle warning or challenge that might only reveal itself in the fullness of time. She smiled faintly, appreciating the puzzle it offered. There was no urgency to resolve it now. The solution, she knew, would reveal itself when the moment was right. The world of human behaviour was an endless labyrinth, and even when one thread was unravelled, another awaited. She considered the residents of Davenport Manor, their reactions, gestures and statements, and understood that each would carry the experience forward in their own way, shaped by fear, insight and curiosity. The household had faced deception, manipulation and psychological intricacy, yet life would continue, marked now by a subtle awareness that the ordinary was often layered with hidden complexity. Miss Marple leaned back in the carriage, her keen eyes scanning the passing countryside. A crow alighted on a distant fence post, observing with calm, deliberate intelligence. She noted the bird's behaviour and the subtle shifts in the landscape, each detail recorded, each movement catalogued in the quiet recesses of her mind. Human nature, she mused, often mirrored such patterns. Watchful, calculating, observant. Even as the carriage drew her away from Davenport Manor, the lingering question persisted. Who had sent the cryptic letter, and what did it truly signify? Could it be a warning, a puzzle, or merely a playful tease from someone aware of her analytical prowess? Marple knew that the answer would surface only through patient observation, careful attention, and the willingness to follow subtle cues wherever they might lead. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the fields, and Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, that quiet, intellectual excitement that came from knowing a mystery was never truly complete. The cases she solved were seldom closed in any absolute sense. There were always layers beneath layers, patterns unseen and subtle manipulations awaiting discovery. The world offered an unending array of human complexity, and she, with patience and keen observation, would continue to unravel them. As the carriage rolled on toward the horizon, Miss Marple's mind was already cataloguing possibilities, connections and clues, both obvious and hidden. Davenport Manor faded from view, but the lingering shadow of the cryptic note suggested that another challenge awaited, another thread of human behaviour to decode, another subtle pattern to untangle. The mystery, in other words, was far from over. And so, with the first light of morning illuminating the path ahead, Miss Marple moved forward, ever observant, ever patient, aware that while justice could be served and immediate threats resolved, the labyrinth of human behaviour promised puzzles and revelations yet to come. The audience, like the residents of Davenport Manor, was left with a satisfying resolution tinged with curiosity, a quiet sense that while one case had ended, another mystery awaited just beyond the reach of ordinary perception, ready for a mind capable of seeing what others could not.